Today's story is about an event that was so horrifying, the one person who survived it couldn't speak when she finally stumbled, bloody and terrified, out of the forest. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please send the like button on a blind date with Karen to a restaurant that has less than perfect service and no manager on duty. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. By 1993, Ludmila Korovina, who was a 41-year-old Russian hiking instructor, came under fairly intense criticism from her colleagues for being too survivalist with her students. They thought she was a little bit too aggressive with how she pushed her students, putting them in unnecessarily risky situations out in the wild where they weren't really ready for it, and at any point she might push them too far and wind up getting someone killed. Her students, however, absolutely adored her. They said on the mountains she was fearless and in tune with nature, and they felt very safe around her. And then at camp, she was very motherly and tender and always took the time to make sure all of her students were taken care of well before she was. Former students have said the mentorship they received from Ludmila went well beyond just hiking instruction. They said she taught a mindset that they carried with them into adulthood, and they pointed to as one of the main reasons they were successful later in life. In the summer of 1993, Ludmila was scheduled to lead an expedition up to the Hamar-Daban Ridge, which is in eastern Siberia, and it's one of the oldest mountains on the planet. With her on this expedition would be 6 fairly experienced hiking students that ranged in ages from 15 to 24 years old. One of those 6 students was a 23-year-old young man named Sasha, who, although he was not Ludmila's biological son, she called him her son because she had raised him ever since he was a young child, and he looked at Ludmila as his mother. Sasha also happened to be the most physically fit and competent of all 6 hiking students, and he would function more like an assistant to Ludmila on this particular hike rather than a pupil. The other 5 students were 24-year-old Tatiana, 19-year-old Dennis, 16-year-old Victoria, 15-year-old Timur, and 17-year-old Valentina, who she is the only reason we know anything about the horrible things that happened to this group up on Hamar-Daban Ridge. On August 1st, 1993, Ludmila and her hiking group boarded a Trans-Siberian railway car in Kazakhstan, and later that day they arrived in a town called Marino, which is on the eastern side of Siberia on the southern end, and it butts up against the base of the Hamar-Daban mountain range. The Hamar-Daban mountain was not considered a very dangerous hike to make. It was relatively small. It was just under 2,400 meters in elevation, and in the summertime you'd have scores of recreational hikers all over this mountain range. Plus, the weather forecast for Ludmila and her group's multi-day hike in that mountain range was going to be incredibly favorable. It was going to be warm, clear, nice summer weather. Ludmila had charted a course that began just outside of the town of Marino, which is the town they were staying in that first night. They were going to start next to Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in Russia. From the lake, they were going to move north and inland over this stretch that was totally barren. There was no trees, it was just rocks and grass, before ultimately reaching the Hamar-Daban Ridge, which was their destination. And at that point, there would be shelter and firewood, and they could take a break before ultimately descending. And so in total, from the lake all the way to Hamar-Daban Ridge was approximately 50 miles. Ludmila's group would not be the only group making this particular movement towards Hamar-Daban Ridge. They'd be taking their own path, but there'd be 2 other groups that were on similar courses, basically parallel to them, making their way up to the ridge. And one of those groups was actually led by Ludmila's 16-year-old biological daughter, and they had actually made plans to meet up on one of the last days of this multi-day hike. As they were making their descent, there was a forest they were going to meet up in. So Ludmila and her 6 students stayed the night in Marino, and the next morning they got up early and made their way over to Lake Baikal. The weather's beautiful, they're excited to start their journey, and they take off. And everything was going great until the late afternoon. It would turn out the weather forecasters were just completely wrong, and as soon as the group climbed above the tree line, the temperatures plummeted and it started raining and snowing on them. It was just absolutely miserable. This treacherous weather would persist over the next few days, and it really started to destroy the morale in the group. But Ludmila, she was a pro, and she had hiked in far worse conditions than this, and so she made a point of telling the group that this stuff happens. Bad weather happens. We are prepared. We are trained. We're going to be fine. You need to have a positive attitude about this. We need to just keep pushing forward and not play a victim here. And that was enough to inspire the group to just keep on going. You know, they believed in Ludmila and she's telling them to keep going, so they kept going. By the evening of August 4th, so this is 3 full days of hiking later, they were only about 30 minutes away from the summit. They have now reached the point where they are in the open section of the mountain where there's no reprieve from the wind or the rain or the snow. There's no trees to block anything. And so it's just an absolute abomination trying to climb this last stretch. Every step is like an eternity as the wind just cuts through their clothes and they're soaking wet and miserable. Ludmila's students were not about to ask for a break. They knew how she operated. She was someone that really believed in pushing through your own pain and fatigue and misery, and she always led by example, and they saw her, you know, right out in front leading the charge up towards the Hamar-Daban Ridge. And so they were very surprised when she stopped and she turned around and told them, we're taking a break. And in fact, we're actually going to camp out for the night right where we are right here. No one knows why Ludmila made this decision. You know, on the one hand, it does make sense to take a break and say, you know what, we'll reach the summit tomorrow. We've had a really hard couple of days here with the bad weather. We'll make camp and we'll get some rest and we'll hit the summit tomorrow. That makes sense. But where she elected to make camp does not make sense. She had them stop right smack dab in the middle of this totally open section of the mountain where there are no trees, there's no objects to protect them from the horrible wind and snow and ice and rain that's just going to be pelting them all night. And so some people have speculated that when she looked at her crew of hikers, they were so badly beaten down and tired and miserable that she knew she could not ask them to go any further. And so that was why she said, let's just make camp here, we'll make do. Others have said her map may not have been very accurate. And so she didn't know how close she was to the summit, where at the summit there was literally a shelter that had firewood and a place for you to rest. Maybe she didn't know she was so close. Perhaps she thought she was much farther away and this is the best we can do. But what the inaccurate map theory does not account for is Ludmila would have known there is a forest about 2.5 miles down the mountain, because the whole time they've been on this hike, they've tried to stay up above the tree line as they make this final approach up to the ridge. And so she would have known there's a forest right down there. And if I wanted to, I could go down there and seek shelter in the trees. And so for whatever reason, she decided that we can't go down to the forest, we gotta stay here. And so perhaps that lends more credibility to the idea that the group was far more beaten down than maybe we even realized. And she thought they can't make the 2.5 mile journey. We're gonna have to just make camp here and make do. But regardless of her reasoning, they did make camp right in the middle of this open section. They set up 2 wet, crappy tents, and they used their little kerosene stoves to make a tiny meal, and then they all crammed inside of these 2 tents and huddled as the wind howled outside. That night, the storm got much worse. The wind picked up, and again, they're totally exposed on this open section of the mountain, and so they're just getting destroyed by this wind. And at about 2 a.m., the wind actually broke the ropes that were holding the tents down, and they had to go outside and retie them, and they were able to do that. And then a couple hours later, at about 4 a.m., the wind actually lifted up the section of the tent that was facing where the wind was blowing, and it pulled the tent up in such a way that water rushed into the tent and soaked their sleeping bags. And they were able to go outside, and they put the stakes back down in the ground, but you know, they were sleeping in wet sleeping bags in the middle of this mountain in the middle of a storm. So this is getting quite dangerous at this point. But they were able to eventually fall asleep, and at about 10 a.m. the next morning, Ludmila gets up and looks outside, and she can see that everything is frozen, that it's snowed and the temperatures have dropped again, and everything is just snow and ice. And she knows that, you know, we're actually reaching very dangerous hypothermia territory, and if we don't warm up soon, this could be life-threatening. And so she woke everybody up and she said, we need to go down into that forest and we need to start a fire as soon as possible. And so everybody said, all right, they got up, they started packing up their things, rolled up their tents, and they began walking down the mountain in a line. Although this was not intended, when Ludmila had said, we will reach the summit tomorrow, that had delayed their schedule. And it meant they were not going to be able to meet up with her daughter the next day. But now in the morning, when they're deciding basically to abandon the summit and turn around and head down again, they were now back on schedule to meet up with her daughter down in the forest. However, her daughter said she was at the rendezvous point in the forest, and Ludmila and the 6 other hikers never showed. 4 days later, on August 9th, a group of Ukrainian kayakers were making their way down this river in southern Siberia, and they were passing by the Hamar-Daban mountain range. And so as they're kind of slowly moving their way down. It's this beautiful morning and they're looking up at the mountains all around them. The leader of this group happens to see something move on his left side. There's a forest right up against the left side of this river, and he turns his head and he has to do a double take because there's this girl who's standing there at the edge of the forest looking out at them totally expressionless, and she's covered in blood and she's not doing anything. She's just standing there. And at first he actually thought, like, we need to leave. His first thought was, we need to just get away from this person. There's something wrong with this person. But very quickly the group realized, like, we cannot abandon this girl. This is a young girl who should not be out here. I don't know what she's doing out here. And so they turned around and they went on shore and they yelled to her. They said, are you okay? And she just stood there not reacting. And they tried a couple more times to say, hey, we're not going to hurt you. We just want to know what's going on. And she didn't say a word. She just stood there in shock. She looked very scared. They finally got up right next to her and they asked her, what are you so scared of? Where are you coming from? And they just could not get her to speak. But they're up close looking at her, and she's got blood all over her. She looks dirty. She looks like she might be sick. And so they decide that, this girl needs help, and they had blankets, and so they threw blankets over her. They put her in one of the kayaks, and they brought her back to town. Once in town, the Ukrainian kayakers went and got authorities and said, hey, we found this girl. She was covered in blood, walking out of the forest. We have no idea what's going on with her. And so authorities came over to speak to her, and although she barely spoke, she would finally say that she was 17 years old, her name was Valentina Yudachenko, and that she had been a part of a 7-person hiking group up along the Hamar-Devan Ridge. And then she paused, and they said, well, where's your hiking group? How did you get separated? This is what she told them. Back on the morning of August 5th, so this would have been the morning after that terrible night's sleep on the mountain where the tent ropes are breaking and their sleeping bags are getting soaking wet. Well, Valentina wakes up and she looks outside of the tent and she sees Ludmila, and she's standing there with her hands on her hips and she's looking around. She looks very concerned. Valentina goes out there and Ludmila turns to her and says, we need to leave. We need to go down to the forest. We need to make a fire. Can you help me wake everybody up and start having them pack up their stuff so we can get moving? So Valentina goes in, she starts waking people up, and everybody very quickly packs up the tent, packs up their things, and they're in a line and they start walking down the mountain. They had only made it about 10 meters into their descent when Sasha, the 23-year-old young man that Ludmila considered her son, he just suddenly falls, and the other hikers, Valentina included, run over and they help get him up again, and he looks kind of shaken. He takes a couple more steps and he falls again. And this time, when Valentina goes over to try to help him up with the others, they see his eyes are wide and he looks like he's really terrified, and then blood starts rushing out of his nose and his ears and his mouth, and then he just suddenly dies. And Ludmila runs over and she grabs him and she's panicking and she's trying to feel for a pulse and she's checking for his heart, and then she screams out in pain and anguish and she yells, he's dead. The other hikers can't believe this is happening. They can't even process that someone, any of them, had died, let alone it be Sasha, the most physically fit and healthy one of all of them, including up until a few minutes ago. He wasn't showing any signs or symptoms that something was wrong. He was perfectly fine. What's going on? Ludmila was in shock. She's on the ground and she's holding on to Sasha, and she's telling the group that she's not going anywhere. She's staying with Sasha. And Valentina would say the group is just falling apart at this point. You have some of them that are crying, others who are just standing there looking around like, what's happening to us right now? And at some point, Ludmila collects herself and she says to the group, go down to the forest. Go down to the forest and start a fire. And Valentina said they didn't want to leave her and they were pleading with her to let them stay. And she said, no, go down to the forest and start a fire. And finally, Valentina said the group would. They'd get together and they'd turn around, and not really knowing what was going to happen next, they just begin walking down this mountain, and they only get a few steps before they hear Ludmila yell out to come back. She's saying, I can't move. And they turn around and Valentina was towards the front of the returning group as they're going back up the mountain, back to Ludmila. And she's now bleeding out of her nose and her ears and her mouth. And she's heaving like something's going on inside of her. And then all of a sudden she keels over on top of Sasha and she dies right in front of them. And now the group is in hysterics. And Valentina's in the front and she can't see anybody else. And then she turns around and she can't believe what she's seeing to her side. Now everybody else is bleeding from their nose and their ears and their mouth, and some of them are frothing from the mouth. Valentina reached for her mouth and her ears and her nose to look for blood, and there wasn't any. And then she turned and she saw 16-year-old Victoria and 24-year-old Tatiana suddenly fall to the ground, just like Sasha had, except they weren't just laying there. They began rolling around and ripping their clothes off and clutching at their throats, and they're frothing at the mouth. And so Valentina reaches down to try to help Victoria, the 16-year-old, and Victoria bites her on the hand and she pulls her hand back. And then Victoria curls into a ball and then goes still. And then Tatiana begins hitting her head on a rock over and over and over again until she goes still. At this point, Valentina is in pure survival mode. And so she looks at the other two, which was 15-year-old Timur and 19-year-old Dennis. Everybody else is down on the ground at this point. And she sees Dennis is moving behind a rock, and he looks like he's not acting as erratic as everybody else. And so she starts making her way over to Dennis to see if he's going to be okay. And on the way, she sees 15-year-old Timur fall to the ground, and he's suddenly lying there still. And so she believes he's dead too. She gets over to Dennis, and he's bleeding profusely from all of his orifices in his head, but he's talking to her. And he's saying, okay, you need to go back to your bag, get out whatever you can that is essential, ditch the rest, and run down to the forest, and I'll meet you down there. And so Valentina says, okay. She makes her way up to her bag. She gets her sleeping bag and a couple other small items. And when she turns around to go back to Dennis, she sees that he's now slouched over his backpack, and now the blood is just pouring out of his head. And she can tell that almost certainly he's dead as well. And so not only is she all alone, she's now totally traumatized and believes whatever has happened to them is going to happen to her. And so she runs down the mountain and she goes into the forest, and she gets underneath this rock overhang. She puts her sleeping bag down, she crawls inside, and she drifts in and out of consciousness for the rest of the day. And then that night, she's still laying there, and the storm picked up dramatically, and she could hear all night these huge trees all over the mountain falling and slamming all around her. And so she's thinking, if I don't die from whatever killed my friends, I'm going to get hit by one of these trees. But she manages to get through the night. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and so Valentina gets up, and she's thinking to herself, maybe by some miracle, one of them is still alive. And so she climbs back up the mountain to where they were, and she finds all of them still laying exactly where they were when she left them, all motionless, all deceased. And so she decides to go one by one and close each of their eyelids. And then she says her goodbye, and then she turns and kind of wanders back into the forest, where she would stay for the next 4 days, desperately walking around, hoping to be rescued at some point, the whole time just expecting to die, either from exposure, from an animal attack, from whatever killed my friends. Eventually she does hear voices, and she starts making her way towards where they're coming from, and that's when she gets to the river and she sees the Ukrainian kayakers, who ultimately pick her up and bring her back to town. After authorities heard Valentina's story and realized there were other hikers out there, they launched a search party, and it would take them a month to locate them. Their bodies were contorted and their faces were locked in these grimaces that looked like they were in absolute terror and agony right as they died. In addition to missing most of their clothing and their shoes, they were also all missing their eyeballs. The autopsies were only able to conclude that hypothermia contributed to their death, although it wasn't the only factor, as well as a protein deficiency, despite the fact that they had all eaten well over the course of their trip, and that all of their lungs were very bruised, but they didn't know what that was from. But nothing the autopsy concluded could reconcile what Valentina said she saw happen, which was a sudden, violent death of 6 healthy people with no signs and symptoms leading up. Suddenly, they are bleeding out of every orifice, and they're falling to the ground, tearing their clothes off, grabbing at their throats, frothing at the mouth, and then dying. And whatever happened to them, why didn't it happen to Valentina? To this day, we don't really have a good answer why that happened, and the case is closed. It was ruled they mostly died of hypothermia, and it was an accident, and that's that. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened in Russia. In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, and about 10 days into their hike, they reached a part where they needed to crest over this mountain before some bad weather rolled in. And they started moving up this mountain, which would be renamed the Dyatlov Pass after the leader of this group. His name is Dyatlov. They started making their way up the Dyatlov Pass, and they were going too slowly, and the weather was coming in too quickly. And so they had to make a critical decision: stay put, but be in this totally exposed, open mountain face, much like the Hamar Daban situation where they were up on that open mountain face, either hunker down there and get ruined by weather, and the weather was a lot worse for the Dyatlov Pass group. It was, sub-zero temperatures and just snowing ruthlessly. Or they could go down and give up ground and go down to the forest at the base of this mountain where you'd be sheltered from the storm with some trees. And so these hikers who might be a little bit overconfident in their ability decide to stick it out right on this mountain face. And over the course of that night, at some point, they cut open their tent with a knife from the inside and ran out into sub-zero temperatures, most of them not wearing shoes, not wearing jackets, not wearing pants. They're basically in underwear. And they calmly walked down the mountain, all the way down to the forest. And once they got down there, two of them tried to desperately climb this big tree where there wasn't any low-hanging branches. And so they couldn't climb up it. We don't know what they were trying to climb up it for, but they ended up building this little tiny fire that could not have provided very much warmth at all. And they were found deceased lying around this fire. The 7 other hikers were found in 2 different areas. One that appeared to go down to that tree where those 2 were, but then doubled back and tried to get up to the campsite, but didn't make it and fell to the ground and died there. The other group was not found for a couple of weeks later. They were found at the mouth of this river. They were inside of this den, and they were wearing the clothes of the other hikers that were deceased. And the clothes they had on had traces of radiation on them. And the ones that were in the den had these devastating chest and skull injuries, and one of them was missing their eyeballs. And the official statement by the Soviet Union was they died from an unknown compelling force, which is a really mysterious way to describe how someone might die. This case was actually reinvestigated in 2020, and the new cause of death is death by avalanche, except loads of people disagree with that. In fact, experts have gone out to where this happened, and they say not only was there no avalanche, there's never been an avalanche in this area. There's literally never been one. So what do you think? Is there a connection between Hamar-Daban and the Dyatlov Pass incident? Is there a cover-up in both cases where something far more sinister has happened to both groups that we don't know about? Or are they unrelated and these are just both examples of Mother Nature being far more powerful than we even realize? So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you caught today's secret in the video, please let us know in the comment section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's story and you haven't done this already, please send the like button out on a blind date with Karen at a restaurant that is below perfect service and does not have a manager on call that night. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Far and away, the scariest part of the story is Jason's when he brings the Dybbuk box home and he goes to bed that first night and then the following night what he sees in his living room. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, at the next solar eclipse, offer the like button a pair of children's cardboard 3D glasses and tell them that they can look directly at the solar eclipse with these on. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In 2003, Kevin Mannis owned an antique shop right in downtown Portland at the base of the Burnside Bridge, which is considered the gateway to the city. Because Kevin owned this antique shop, he was always at yard sales and estate sales looking to find the next thing he could sell at his shop. And so one day there was this estate sale over at this woman's house. She had just passed away. She was about 103 years old. She was a Holocaust survivor and her estate was being sold. And so he goes over to the house and he sees the way they're selling all of her items is by bundling them in different lots. So depending on what item it was, they'd be bundled with similar items and then sold as a package. So the people there would be bidding on the whole lot. They couldn't buy individual items. And Kevin had his eye on one particular lot called Lot 29, and Lot 29 included a couple of small tools that he wanted to sell in his shop, and it had this mystery box, and that's exactly as it was labeled. It just says mystery box on it. and he was intrigued by it. And so he placed a bid on lot 29, and ultimately he won the bid, and he was really happy about it. So he takes the contents of lot 29 and he wheels them over to his car. And as he's loading stuff into the back of his car, someone behind him says, "Oh, so you went with the Dybbuk box, huh?" And Kevin in his head went right back to his childhood, because growing up, he had always been scared of Dybbuks, because a Dybbuk is a malevolent spirit in Jewish folklore, and Kevin was Jewish, and so his parents used to say, "Oh, you better not do that, Kevin, or the Dybbuk's gonna get you." And so he grew up terrified of Dybbuks, and so his interest is piqued. And Kevin turns around and he says, "Did you just call this box a Dybbuk box?" And the woman's like, "Yeah, and my grandmother was terrified of it, and she said no one could ever open it." And Kevin turns to look at the box, and it's about 2 foot high by 1 foot wide, and there are these little doors that swing open on the front, and then on the bottom there's a drawer that comes out, and there's one lock that sits across the 2 doors, and it's currently locked with a little padlock. And he looks up at her and he goes, "Why can't you open it?" And the woman just says, "We never knew, but our grandmother would always go every time we said the word Dybbuk, and so it was weird enough that we just never asked any questions and we stayed away from her Dybbuk box." Kevin agreed that was pretty weird, and he finished loading his car, shut the trunk, said bye to the woman, hopped in his car, and he drove away. And he never really gave it a second thought. At this point, he's not thinking the Dybbuk box is anything malevolent. He thinks it's just some random chest that he won at an auction. Kevin drives back to his antique shop and he begins unloading all the things he won at the auction. He brings them inside and he brings them downstairs, because the top floor, the main floor, was really where he sold things. When he got new items, he would bring them downstairs to his warehouse of sorts, which was much bigger than the first floor, had lots of rows of shelving, and it had a workstation down there. He would bring his new things down there and he would price them and get them ready before bringing them back up. And at some point, he brought the Dybbuk box in and he brought it down and he put it on the back table. He was about to just leave it there and go back upstairs when suddenly he became really curious and he really wanted to open the Dybbuk box. And so he goes over and he kind of yanks on the front 2 doors. He doesn't want to damage it, but he can tell this lock is relatively new and it's not just going to come off. And so he doesn't have the key to it and he doesn't have a way to clip the lock. And so he takes a screwdriver and he basically wedges it underneath the actual metal clasps that are attached to the wood. And he slowly kind of bends it up and bends it off and pops it out of the wood. And as soon as he does that, the doors swing open and there's like a mechanical device inside of the Dybbuk box that activates the drawer. Basically, anytime the doors open, the drawer also opens at the same time. And Kevin remembered thinking how silly it was that this kind of old, crummy looking wine closet had this fairly complicated mechanism inside of it that still worked. Inside the Dybbuk box were 2 pennies from the 1920s. There was a used candle. There were 2 locks of hair. There was this small tombstone that said Shalom on it. And there was also a small wine goblet that was inside, and that was it. And Kevin immediately thought, well, this is just some older woman's keepsake, and these things maybe have sentimental value to her, but they don't to me. And so he shut the Dybbuk box, pushed it to the side of the desk, and walked upstairs and didn't give it another thought. Kevin had one employee at the antique shop. Her name was Jane. She was a younger woman. She was an incredible saleswoman, and Kevin thought very highly of her. And so the day after he had brought the Dybbuk box into the antique shop and put it downstairs on the desk, he needed to run out and do some errands, and so he put Jane in charge of the store. And so Kevin leaves, and Jane locks the front door to the shop behind Kevin because she needed to go downstairs and get a few items that she wanted to bring upstairs to sell that day, and it was before opening time. So front door's locked, no one else is inside the shop, and Jane goes down into the basement. Once you went down the wooden steps into the basement, you'd be looking out at this huge room of all these industrial shelves that run the length of the room where they would keep their antiques and other valuables on. And the lighting down there was never that great because they used these long fluorescent tube lights that at best cast a kind of subtle yellow glow on everything. They were not particularly bright. And it was a real pain to actually go up and change them because you needed to place a ladder, but the ladders were not perfectly aligned with the lights. You basically had to reach over the shelving where all the antiques were, and you ran the risk of knocking things over. And so a lot of times Jane and Kevin would wait until you were down to like 1 or 2 crappy working lights before they'd say, okay, we really got to go up there and replace some of these bulbs. And so as it happens, this day, they're down to like 2 or 3 working lights. So in classic horror movie fashion, she's going into this dingy basement with very poor lighting. And so once she gets to the bottom of the steps, she walks to the far end of the room, a little bit away from where the Dybbuk box was placed on that back table. She's in the other corner in the back of this basement, and she's getting some things off the shelf when all of a sudden she stops, and she can't help but shake the feeling that she feels like someone is watching her. Now, she is down in this basement all the time, whether it's well lit or dark, whether Kevin is there with her or she's alone. This is a place she goes all the time, and she's never had this feeling before. There's no way to get into the basement unless you come down the stairs, and she locked the front door, and she was the only one who came downstairs. She hasn't heard anything. There's no other way to leave this space, so she doesn't know where she's getting this feeling from, but she really can't shake it. And as she's kind of looking around and she's starting to get a little bit paranoid, the phone rings. They had a landline that was on a table right at the base of the stairs. The phone rings down there and it startles her. And then it kind of jumps her back into reality, and she's like, okay, I'm getting paranoid. And she walks over and she picks up the phone, and it's actually her friend who was planning on coming by the antique shop that day. So as they're chatting, Jane hears what sounds like a broom. Imagine if a push broom is lined up against the wall and then it falls over, the sound that the wooden stick would make as it hits concrete. That's the sound she hears as she's on the phone. And it startles her again, and she goes, hey, let me call you back. She hangs up on her friend and she's looking out, and because the lighting is terrible from where she is, she's now at the foot of the stairs looking down all these rows, and she's heard that stick land on the ground on the far side back where she had been originally. She's kind of looking around and she can't see anything. And so she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the rows to see what fell over. And as she's walking down the row, something smashes behind her, and she turns around and one of the fluorescent tube lights has fallen from the ceiling and smashed onto the ground. And so all of a sudden she doesn't want to explore this falling broom that's behind her in the dark corner of the basement. Instead, she's ready to leave. And so she starts walking back towards the stairs to get out of here. And as she's walking down one of these rows, a wooden chair that is on one of the shelves comes flying off of it and lands squarely in the middle, blocking her path. And there's no way this could have happened unless someone pushed this chair. And suddenly she thinks, someone's down here with me. And she screams and she hurdles the chair and she runs to the steps. She starts running up, and to her horror, there is a metal door that locks the basement at night. So if someone were to break in, it's another layer to protect the store from thieves. And it was shut and locked. It can only be locked from the outside and with a key. So there's no way she would have done this by accident. And now she's freaking out because she's trapped in the basement with some person running around, pushing chairs over and breaking lights. And so she grabs the gate and she starts shaking it, and she's yelling for Kevin, thinking maybe he came in and forgot I was down here and shut and locked the gate. And she's checking over her shoulder, looking down into the basement, and she starts hearing more lights falling off the ceiling and shattering on the ground. She is in absolute panic mode. She's just waiting for someone to come bounding up the stairs towards her. She has no idea what to do. She pulls out her phone and she calls Kevin. Meanwhile, Kevin is making his way back to the antique shop. He's only a couple minutes away, and he sees his phone ringing that was sitting on the passenger seat, and he picks it up, and it's Jane, and he answers, and immediately Jane is hysterical, and she's screaming that someone's in the antique shop that's breaking things, and Kevin's like, slow down, what's going on? And all he can hear in the background is the sound of what sounds like glass shattering and things falling and breaking. And he's like, wait, what's going on? Are you okay, Jane? Like, where are you? And he hears her say, someone's in the basement. And he goes, well, where are you? And she's like, I'm in the basement. And he was like, get out of the basement, call the police. But as he's trying to get her to do that, the phone cuts out. Kevin was only about a block away from his shop, so he floors it to his shop. He parks outside and he's thinking to himself, what am I walking into? Is there going to be like an active burglary going on? Is she going to be held hostage? Like, are the police going to be there? But he just knows he needs to get in there to Jane, and he gets to the front door and it's locked. So he unlocks the front door and he goes inside and it's silent. When he's looking around, there's no damage to the first floor. There's no damage anywhere. And he yells for Jane. There's no answer from Jane. And he starts walking kind of tentatively through the store towards the back. And he gets to that door leading down into the basement, the same one that Jane couldn't open when she ran up the stairs to get out of the basement. And he looks at it, and Jane's not at the top of the stairs anymore. And he's thinking, I didn't lock that door, and I'm the only one with the key to lock that door. How is it locked right now? Does Jane have a key that I don't know about? And why would she lock it? Does that mean Jane's up here somewhere? Is that what happened? And he's like, Jane, come out. Did you lock this door? But Jane's not on the first floor, and their first floor is very small. And so he thinks, okay, she has to be downstairs. And so he opens up the gate, he swings it open, and he starts walking down the steps. And he's really cautious as he's going down because, again, he has no idea what he's walking into. He hits the lights, but the lights don't work down there. And as he starts to bend around the corner where he can actually see into the basement, he sees Jane sitting at the chair right next to that table where that phone is, and she's just sitting there kind of stunned. And he goes to Jane and he's like, what happened down here? And he glances out quickly at all the rows and he sees all this furniture that's come off the shelves, and there's glass all over the ground. And he's looking at Jane, and Jane's just showing no reaction. She's sitting there like she's in shock. And he turns to Jane again and he says, come on, you gotta tell me what happened down here. And Jane just goes, I don't know. I don't know how to explain what happened down here. I was walking down the row, and then I felt like someone was watching me, and then things are falling off the ceiling and the shelves. I've never seen anything like this before. Now at this point, Kevin's adrenaline is through the roof. He came charging in here thinking he was gonna have to save Jane from some person breaking in and breaking stuff, but as far as he can tell, there's no one here but Jane. And so he decides he's gonna take a flashlight and he's gonna explore the basement because either there's someone here or Jane did this. So he grabs his flashlight and he starts walking around, and all he sees is a bunch of broken glass and some furniture that's come off the shelves and a couple other things that are on the ground. But other than that, there's no one down here, and there's no other way to come in or out of here besides the stairs. So after Kevin is certain that no one else is here, he turns to Jane, and he regrets this now. He says in an interview that he feels horrible about this now, but at the time, he's thinking to himself, you know, this had to have been Jane. Who else would have done this? I don't know why she did this, but there's no one else here. And he goes, Jane, did you do this? And this is when Jane's emotions came through, because before she was in shock, now she's mad. And she goes, F you, Kevin. And she leaves. And she doesn't say another word to him, and she doesn't come back. She quits on the spot. But at the time, Kevin believed she had done it. So he was kind of like, oh well. He was not even a little bit thinking the Dybbuk box had anything to do with this. Just a couple of days after the basement incident, Kevin's mother was supposed to come by the antique shop, and the two of them were going to leave and get lunch together to celebrate her birthday. As soon as she walked into the shop, Kevin goes, hey mom, I got a gift for you. And he brings over this wrapped box and he sets it down on a table right in front of his mother, who's sitting on a chair. And he unwraps it, and it's the Dybbuk box. Before Kevin can explain what it is, the phone rings at the other end of the store, and he was expecting a call, and he goes, hold on mom, I gotta get this. And he goes to the back of the store to answer the call while his mom is just sitting there looking at the box. And so while Kevin is at the other end of the store, his mother opens the Dybbuk box, and she says she had to sit down as soon as she opened it because she had this unbelievable, overwhelming sense of dread as soon as the doors were open. And she's staring at it like she can't take her eyes away, and then all of a sudden she has a massive stroke. And so she keels over, and she can't move, and she can't talk. And Kevin sees this happening. He runs over and he's like, Mom, what's going on? He calls 911. And as the paramedics are working on her, she would say that while she was in this kind of paralyzed state, when she couldn't talk and she couldn't move, all she wanted to communicate was to somehow get her son to get rid of that box. She didn't know why, but she felt like the box had something to do with her having the stroke. And so all she could do was move her eyes. And so she found herself, because her son's right here, looking at the Dybbuk box and looking away, looking at the Dybbuk box, looking away, hoping her son would see her eyes as a signal to look at the Dybbuk box and put it together that that thing's bad. And Kevin does realize that his mom is flicking her eyes at the Dybbuk box, but in the moment, he's much more concerned about the health of his mother. And it wasn't until she got put in a hospital and she was being taken care of and he knew she'd be okay, that he remembers, he kind of went over it in his head later that day, that his mom was really scared looking, and she was looking at the Dybbuk box like that was the thing that was causing her to be scared. Not the stroke, the Dybbuk box. And Kevin starts thinking to himself, I don't know, there's something off about the Dybbuk box. Either it's really bad luck, or there's some truth to you don't open up this Dybbuk box. Either way, I don't want to take any more chances, because so long as I've owned this thing, I've had a horrible thing happen in the basement, and now my mom's had a stroke, so I want to get rid of it. So Kevin puts the Dybbuk box at the front of his antique store, and he puts it up for sale. And very quickly, a young couple came into the store, and they bought the Dybbuk box. And Kevin's relieved. He's like, thank goodness, that bad luck charm, that whatever's going on with that thing is gone and out of my life. But just a couple of days later, he was in the back of the shop when he heard the door open and then the door shut, and he walked out expecting to see some customers, but instead he sees the Dybbuk box that's sitting right inside his store. Someone must have just dropped it off. And so he walks up to it and he sees there's a piece of paper that's been taped to the top of the Dybbuk box. and there's writing on it. And all it says is, "This has an odd darkness about it." This really freaked Kevin out because in a way, it was like other people were confirming that something was wrong with this box. Kevin did not want the Dybbuk box to be in his store, so he put it in his car and he drove back to his house and he put it in his storage locker and he locked it up and then went back to work for the day. That night when he went home, he went to bed and he had this dream. Or in the dream, he's walking in this courtyard and he's holding the hand of this woman who he believes is his friend, and he trusts this person, and the area he's in feels very friendly, and it's a very positive dream. And as he's walking, all of a sudden, this person starts to pull away from him, and he can't move anymore, and he's losing the grip on this person's hand. And they keep moving and moving until their hand is out of his, and they disappear into the corner of the courtyard where it's totally dark. And so he's looking into the darkness, waiting for his friend to come out again, and he can't move. He's anchored to the spot, and as he's looking, he sees what looks like an old woman walking out of the mist, and her head is down, and he can't tell what she's doing, and she's pretty far away, and she's walking closer and closer to him, and when she's about 5-6 feet away, she raises her head up, and her whole face is falling off. All the skin is falling off of her face. It's rotting. She's like a corpse, and she raises her hands up in front of her, then she grabs his face and begins pulling off pieces of his face until he suddenly wakes up. Kevin had to compose himself in bed because he was so scared from the dream he just had. He sits up and he goes into the bathroom to get a sip of water, and as he walks past the mirror, he notices there are marks on his shoulders and his arms that he did not have before. It looks like bruising almost. And he's looking at them and he's thinking, no way. That has nothing to do with the dream. This is just coincidence that, she was grabbing me in this area in the dream and now I have marks there. It's just coincidence. And so he kind of writes it off and he goes back to bed. And he has the same dream. He gets up again and he's breathing heavily, he's sweating because he just had the same dream. It was this terrifying dream. And he goes back into the bathroom and now his entire back is covered in bruises. He has bruises all over his back, all over his arms. He's got red marks on his neck. And now in his mind, he feels like it has to do with the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is now in my backyard. It's not a coincidence that all of a sudden I'm having these horrific dreams that are apparently manifesting themselves in bruises and marks on my actual body. And so Kevin is done with the Dybbuk box, and instead of going back to bed, he goes to his computer and he puts the Dybbuk box on eBay up for sale. And that night, 2 college kids named Sam and Brian, who lived in Missouri, they buy the Dybbuk box, and Kevin could not be happier to package that thing up and ship it off. Sam and Brian had seen the ad on eBay for the Dybbuk box, and at first it did not seem remarkable, but they saw that Kevin had given this really detailed description of all the strange things that had happened for him since he owned the Dybbuk box. And I think clearly Kevin's angle was he was almost trying to advertise it to groups of people that might be interested in that. And Sam and Brian were exactly that demographic because they were looking for things online that were considered haunted. They wanted to see if ghosts and the paranormal were real, and so they were eager to buy the Dybbuk box and test it out. And so 3 weeks later, when this package finally arrives in Missouri at their house, Brian was still out at class, but Sam was home, so he receives the package, he eagerly brings it into the kitchen, he unpackages it, and he sets it on the kitchen table, and just a few minutes later, Brian comes home, and Brian would say in interviews that when he walked in, it smelled like someone had peed all over the apartment, like there was urine everywhere. And he's walking around thinking, what happened? This smells so bad in here. And he walks into the kitchen where it was the strongest smell, and there's Sam proudly standing next to this awful looking chest, which was of course the Dybbuk box, and he realizes, Brian does, that the Dybbuk box is what smells like urine. And he goes, Sam, do you smell that? And Sam's like, yeah, that's the smell of ghosts. Sam would pick it up and go, ooh, to Brian as soon as he walked into the kitchen, and Sam joked about how he couldn't wait to sleep in the same bed as the Dybbuk box. They were just making a big joke out of it. Sam had also set up a blog where he was going to document everything that happened from day one of receiving this Dybbuk box to whenever they got rid of it or till whenever something happened. And for the first 2 weeks they had the Dybbuk box in their possession, nothing did happen. But when Sam started bringing the Dybbuk box out and leaving it right in the middle of these huge parties they would throw, or people were spilling beer on it and they were opening it up and putting things inside of it and making jokes with it, when they were doing that to the Dybbuk box, suddenly they started seeing a pretty significant uptick in strangeness inside of their house. It started with their technology. Sam's laptop crashed and the hard drive was unrecoverable, so he had to replace his laptop. all of their watches just didn't work while they were in the house. No matter what they did, no matter when they fixed it, the watch just simply did not work. Their Xbox would not turn on, but when they brought it to another person's house, it worked just fine. It just couldn't work inside of their house. And the toaster, anytime you turned it on, it basically immediately incinerated whatever you put inside of it. But none of these technological difficulties were frightening to Sam or Brian. They were just frustrating. And I don't even think they were connecting them with the Dybbuk box. It was just this thing that was happening to them. It wasn't until the light bulbs in their house started bursting in the middle of the night that they started to get pretty creeped out about some of the things that were happening in their apartment. That now all of a sudden it did seem like, maybe if the Dybbuk box really is cursed, this might be how it would manifest. And so they'd replace the light bulb, and then sure enough it would burst again. And they couldn't keep light bulbs in because they kept popping, and so their house was dark a lot of the time. But the worst part was when they had this massive insect infestation inside of their apartment. And they were really localized around the Dybbuk box. All these insects would come out of the walls, out of the toilets, out of the sink. They'd come from behind the fridge, and they would all kind of like converge on the Dybbuk box and go inside of it. The Dybbuk box at one point was swarming with insects all over, and they had to shut the door. They couldn't even go in the room with the Dybbuk box because it was just covered in insects. But despite how scary this was for the boys, they had become kind of like a cool talking point on campus because of Sam's blog that a lot of other students were following. And so the boys kind of liked the clout they got with that, and they decided they didn't want to get rid of the box after all. But it wasn't long after the insect infestation that Sam began losing all of his hair, and at the same time, he started having this constant hallucination that there was an old woman in his peripheral vision on either side of his head pretty much at all times. Anywhere he went, there basically was someone he couldn't quite see following him around. Whether he was well rested, whether he was totally exhausted, it didn't matter. He always saw this shrouded dark figure that he believed was an old woman, and it scared him so much he couldn't sleep. And so he began going into Brian's room and sitting on Brian's bed because it was the one place he felt a little bit of comfort. And as he's sitting on the bed, he would see these dark figures standing on either side of him all night. And so finally, no matter how cool their blog was, it became too much, and they decided we have to get rid of the Dybbuk box. And so they put it on eBay, and very quickly it gets sold to a guy named Jason, who is this museum director over at this other university in Missouri. And he had actually been following along with Sam's blog. He was very interested in what was going on with the Dybbuk box. And when it was listed for sale, he was all over it. He wanted to buy it. So the boys eagerly ship off the Dybbuk box, and Jason receives it in the middle of a workday. So he puts the package in his truck, and he goes upstairs and he works for the day. And then afterwards, when everyone's left the office, he goes downstairs, gets the package, brings it back up to his office, puts it on his desk, and he cuts open the packaging. Jason decided he wanted to evaluate the Dybbuk box the way he would evaluate any other antique or item that was coming into the museum that he was the director of. And so Jason starts by taking a whole bunch of pictures all around the outside of the Dybbuk box, and then he gets his blacklight out and he begins scanning around the outside, and he finds all these traces of wax all over the outside, which leads him to believe this was probably used in some sort of ritual. And then he takes a deep breath and he sits down right in front of the Dybbuk box, and he pops off the lock, he gets ready, and he opens the doors, and the drawer slides out with that whole mechanical device. It all kind of comes open, and Jason's totally let down because nothing happens. And part of him thought, like, if this thing is haunted, as soon as you open it up, the haunting's going to begin. And nothing happened. And he's pretty let down about it. And so ultimately, after staring at it and looking at the pennies that are in there and the Shalom statue and the locks of hair, he's just kind of let down by it, and he decides, okay, I kind of got my hopes up for something. This was clearly a hoax. There's nothing going on here. It's just a random old chest. And so he closes it up, and he puts it on another desk that wasn't the one that he worked at, but was just kind of another table inside of this office that he shared with some other people. And he figured it would be a good talking point to tell his colleagues about, and it would be kind of like a showpiece. So the next day, his colleagues come in, and he explains what a Dybbuk box is and the history around it, that it's supposed to be haunted, and it makes people sick and gives people strokes, and there's been insects that have been known to come out of it and go into it. It's this very creepy thing, and his colleagues are like, wow, that's pretty cool, but they don't think much of it until all of the electronics inside of their office start to fail. Namely, their computers start crashing, and their IT department comes up, and they're like, we don't know why this is happening, but sorry, we can't recover it. And the light bulbs kept going out to the point where they went out and got this huge pack of extra light bulbs to replace the light bulbs as they went out. Something they never had to do before, But all of a sudden, the Dybbuk box is in the room, and the light bulbs are going out left and right. And then finally, Jason's co-workers that share that space with the Dybbuk box, they all got sick. And they blamed the Dybbuk box. They said, you know what? We were fine until that thing came in here. Now all of a sudden our computers don't work, the lights don't work, and we're getting sick. Get rid of it, Jason. So that day after work, Jason goes and takes the Dybbuk box, puts it in the back of his truck, and his truck had a cover on the back. So he secures it in the back, he drives home, and he doesn't want to bring it inside because it just seemed weird to bring a cursed object inside that his coworkers just made him get out of their space because it was making them sick and it was ruining their things. So he thinks, okay, I'll leave it in my truck overnight and I'll figure out what I'm going to do with it tomorrow. He goes inside, he says hi to his family, and before long it's time for bed and Jason goes to sleep. In order to understand what happened to Jason, you need to understand the layout of his house. When you open the front door, you walk inside and there's a wall on your right-hand side. That's the side of the house. And you walk forward about 5 or 6 feet, and on your left is a staircase that goes up to the second floor. If you walk up that staircase, straight ahead of you is going to be a bathroom. If you go left and walk down the hall another 5 or 6 feet, you come to the master suite where Jason and his wife would sleep. If you walk through that door, there is a wall on your left where there's a big bay window that looks out onto the street. And there's a big street light that sits right outside that projects very orangey yellow light into their room at night. Even though they have a shade up, it's this orange glow that comes through this window right here on this side. And then on the other side of the room is the bed. And the bed is situated where the feet are pointed towards this window over here, and the head of the bed is against this wall. And it's centered on this wall here. And Jason, if you were looking overhead at the top of this bed, Jason's on the left side, so he's the farthest into his room, and his wife is the closest into the room. So that night, Jason goes to bed and he falls asleep. But just a couple hours later, he wakes up suddenly and he can't move his body. He can only move his eyes. He's laying on his back, and the light from the street light is very strong. It's this orangey glow in their whole room. And he's laying there trying to move his hands and his legs, but he can't do it. And as he's doing that, he starts hearing footsteps out on the stairs. And they're distinctive sounds. Slow, plodding steps all the way up to the second floor. And Jason's laying here with his eyes looking towards the door because his door is open and he can barely see into the second floor landing. And he's waiting to see who came up the stairs. And his heart's racing and he's looking, and out of the corner of his eye he sees what looks like a dark figure begin to walk into the room. And his heart starts racing even faster when he can tell it's definitely not someone he knows. It's this woman, this older woman with a shawl over her head, and her head is tucked down so he can't see her. And this is all out of the corner of his eye, and because of the orange hue coming in from the window, he can definitely tell that there is a real solid figure right there. This is not in his imagination, it's right there. And this woman begins shuffling her way across the foot of the bed, and right at the foot of the bed, as Jason's looking at her, she turns and looks directly at him. And then she runs around the corner and she looks down at him and she takes her fingers and she drives them into his eyes. And Jason thinks it's real and he's screaming in pain, and he wakes up and his wife is grabbing him and she's like, Jason, what's wrong? And he's like, what's going on? And she says, honey, it's just a bad dream, you're fine. And he's shaken up, his heart's still racing from this dream he's just had. And he's trying to think, like, that felt really real. And he's like feeling his eyes. And he can't believe that that was a dream. That was the most vivid dream he's ever had in his life. And so eventually he goes back to sleep, and then the next morning when he gets up, he goes in the bathroom and he looks at his eyes, and they're all red around the outside, and the whites of his eyes are covered in blood. His eyes look horrible, like he's having this terrible allergic reaction to something, or it looks like someone might have punched him in the eyes, or maybe gouged his eyes. That's how it looks. And his wife comes in and she's like, what happened to you? And he's like, oh my God, I have no idea. It was around this time that Jason began to think the Dybbuk box might just be cursed, because the 2 previous owners have said in their disclosures on eBay that horrible, vivid dreams, just like the one he had, to include physical manifestations, are part of having this Dybbuk box. Jason considered just dumping this thing in a dumpster somewhere, but then he was concerned that he might be passing on this Dybbuk box to someone who wasn't ready for it. And so he decided he would give it another day and he would do some research about how to properly dispose of a Dybbuk box. And so that night when Jason came back from work, he left the Dybbuk box in his truck covered up in his driveway. And so Jason goes inside, he has dinner with his family, and then he's sitting down in the TV room and he's watching TV with his son. And as they're watching TV quietly, Jason hears his son say, hey Dad, who is that? And he looks over at his son, and his son is pointing behind him. And Jason turns around, and standing right behind him is the same woman who had come in his room with a shawl on that gouged his eyes out in his dream, and then she suddenly disappears. And Jason's looking at his son like, "You just saw that too?" And he's like, "Yeah, who was that?" And so Jason grabs his son, he yells for his wife and says, "We have to leave the house right now." His wife comes downstairs and she's like, "What's going on?" And he was like, "I will explain in the car, and we have to take your car." And so his wife sees how serious Jason is, and she says, "Okay." And they get into her car and they drive down the road. And that's when Jason explains what's going on with the Dybbuk box and how he and his son just saw the same woman that he had seen in his dream the night before that gouged his eyes, and his eyes were red, and his wife's starting to get really scared, and his son's really scared of what's going on. And so the solution they came up with was they were going to drive back to their house, drop Jason off, who was going to get in his truck where the Dybbuk box is still in the back. It's still locked in the back of the truck. And he's going to drive it a few miles outside of town to a rental property they owned that no one was staying in. And he was going to put it in the basement. And it was going to stay there until they figured out how to dispose of it. Because they didn't like the idea of just dumping it somewhere, because they felt like if this is real and it's actually this cursed Dybbuk box, then somebody else is going to be cursed by this Dybbuk box unless we find a way, or at least attempt to find a way to contain it and destroy it. And so Jason gets dropped off, he gets in his truck, he drives to the rental property, he puts it in the basement, he seals it up, and he goes back to his house. Once Jason got back to his house, his wife and his son came back as well. And that night, Jason would go on eBay and he would find the contact information for Kevin, the original owner of the Dybbuk box, after the estate sale. And he called him that night, and Kevin actually picked up, and the two of them spoke, and Kevin ultimately agrees to help Jason find a way to properly dispose of this Dybbuk box. And what Kevin offers to do is drive back to the house where he had originally purchased this Dybbuk box and see if he can get some more information about what it is and what they do with it. The next day, Kevin, the antique shop owner, he goes back to the house where he originally bought the Dybbuk box at the estate sale. He knocks on the door, and an old woman comes to the door, and Kevin introduces himself, and he says, "Hey, I was here not too long ago, and I purchased lot 29 that included that Dybbuk box, and I wanted to know some more information about it." And the woman reacted, and she's like, "I told my family not to sell that. I know what was inside of it, and I know you're not supposed to open it, and I tried to tell my family, and they didn't listen. I really hope you didn't open it." And Kevin's like, "Actually, yeah, I did open it." And he described all the horrible things that happened, and he described selling it and all the subsequent owners, how they've had all these issues, and how they've arrived at this place now where Jason in Missouri is having all these issues, and they're trying to find a way to dispose of it. And that's when Sophie describes what's actually inside of this box. Sophie said she lived in Poland before World War II with her cousin Havila, who was the woman who had passed away, and all her things were being sold at the estate sale. And she said that at the time, it was all the rage to have seances and try to talk to dead people and spirits, and they would just do it for fun. Sophie, Havila, and their mother, they would do this for fun. And Havila had made this Ouija board where she had stitched letters onto this blanket, and they put it over this table, and they would all hold this pendant that was suspended by a chain, and they would ask questions, and they would hope that, a spirit that they were interacting with would interact with this chain, and it would swivel around the pendant, and it would point to the different letters whenever they asked a question, and it would spell out, whatever their answer was. And Sophie said nothing ever happened. It was just kind of a fun thing for them to do. But one time it did work, and they said the chain would go rigid, and it would point over and over, and it would spell the words, "Release me, release me, release me." Sophie said the women were incredulous and didn't believe it at first, but then they started to worry that if they didn't help this thing, that if it were a Dybbuk and were a malevolent spirit, it would find a way to attach itself to one of them. And so Sophie said they devised this ritual where they released it, but into this wine box that they were able to shut and lock. And that wine box became the Dybbuk box, and that Dybbuk box is the same one that was sold to Kevin. Kevin told Sophie that, "What do? We've already opened it up." And she said, "You need to contact a rabbi." And so they would call a rabbi, and apparently they were able to reclaim the Dybbuk inside of the box and lock it and put it away in a secret location where it's been since 2003. And apparently since it's been sealed off, Jason and Kevin have said they've experienced no demonic activity, and they never plan to tell anybody where this thing is because they don't want anyone else to have even the opportunity to reopen the Dybbuk box and have to deal with all the horrible things that they went through. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you found the secret in today's video, please tell us in the comments section and tell us where you found it. So what's the timestamp? And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, at the next solar eclipse, please give the like button a pair of cardboard flimsy children's 3D glasses and tell them with these on, you can look directly at the solar eclipse and be totally safe. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It is linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See you. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to share with you the picture or pictures that are famously associated with them. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please place a Kick Me sticky note on the back of the like button shirt. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 2014, the United States Navy decided it was time to decommission one of their old frigate ships, and so they sent it to a dock to be broken down for scrap. In order for workers to actually be able to access the underside of the ship and actually begin to break it down, they would need to dry dock the ship, which meant the ship would basically drive into this special locking corral where the doors would shut behind it, the water would drain out from underneath, and the ship would be left resting on these huge wooden blocks that elevated it off the ground. And with no water in there, workers were able to get underneath the hull and could access every part of the ship without obstruction. It's important to note for this story that when a ship is in dry dock, there is only one way on or off. It's this ramp called a gangway that leads from the dock onto the deck of the ship. Besides that, there is nowhere else for you to get on this ship. And if for some reason you really wanted to get on and couldn't use the gangway, you could in theory try to run and leap from the dock to the ship. There's a pretty significant gap there all the way around, but you could try the jump. But if you weren't successful at grabbing onto the ship, you would fall multiple stories, probably to your death, because there's no water in the dry dock. So this old frigate ship that was being decommissioned was officially dry docked in July of 2014. The first group of people that went on board the ship to begin dismantling it were military personnel. They were in charge of removing all of the sensitive equipment before civilians were allowed to go on board. The military personnel begin to wrap up, and it's getting late in the day, and they tell the foreman, who's in charge of all of the civilian workers that are going to be going on and finishing this decommissioning of this ship, they go to the foreman and they say, hey, we're done, we're wrapped up for the night, your workers are good to go, they can get on here tomorrow. The foreman would send a message to his boss that night, letting him know that they were on track to start work the next day. The boss would respond and say, hey, can you go on there tonight and take pictures of all the different workstations so we know how many people that we need to place in different segments of this big ship. So the foreman walks onto the ship and proceeds to take hundreds of pictures all over the inside of the ship. Now, the ship itself was pitch black inside. There was no electricity and it was nighttime. So he had a flashlight the whole time, but whenever he took a picture, he would turn his flashlight off and then use the flash on his camera before going back to his actual flashlight. So all night he's going room to room taking all these pictures, and at some point he realizes he's photographed everything he needs to. So he leaves, he goes back to his office, he uploads the pictures, and he sends them to his boss. His boss wrote back almost immediately and just said, "Who's the guy with the axe?" Now, the foreman has no idea what he's talking about. He was just in the ship by himself for a couple of hours and didn't see anyone. So he reads the email again to make sure he read it correctly, and he sees that his boss has actually attached the picture he is referring to. Here is this guy clearly clutching an axe in a hallway that he was just in. And even creepier is the foreman is looking at where this picture was taken, and it was relatively early on in his photo shoot. And he had walked past the exact area where this guy is poking his head out of, which means the whole time he was down there, this guy with an axe was there with him. They review the security footage of a camera that was aimed directly at the ramp, the one entrance in and out of the ship. And from the time the foreman left, no one else left. So they don't know how he got on or how he got off without being detected, but somehow he did. In 2014, Alan Ruby was a 19-year-old freshman studying political science at the University of Oklahoma. Despite being relatively modest and soft-spoken in person, on social media, he projected this lifestyle of wealth and grandeur. He'd oftentimes post pictures of exotic sports cars and expensive watches and clothes, and he would travel the world to Paris, London, New York City, and take all these pictures showing off this incredible life he had. He really wanted people to believe that he was this fabulously wealthy, successful guy. Alan was only able to project this phony lifestyle on social media because he was spending his father's money. His father was a successful businessman who was also the publisher of a newspaper that was quite successful, and so Alan would just spend his money, and then even after his father would give him money, Alan would steal his credit card and additionally rack up thousands of dollars of credit card debt. But as media began to shift away from print media to almost all digital, a lot of newspapers began to fail because they weren't able to transition to digital. And his father's newspaper was not making that transition very well, and they were losing money left and right. And so Alan's father told everybody in his family, with a focus on Alan, that we all need to cut back on our spending because money's tight right now and it's unclear if it's going to turn around. So we got to be careful with how much money we do have. Alan acted like he was going to cut back on his lavish lifestyle, but in reality, he wasn't going to. He was totally addicted to spending money and giving off this vibe that he was so wealthy and successful. And so around this time, Alan steals his grandmother's credit card and secretly leaves the country and goes to Paris to have this vacation on his own. He's taking these pictures in front of the Eiffel Tower and he's spending all this money, and his father finds out that he's stolen this credit card and he's furious. And instead of waiting for Alan to come home and saying, "Don't do that again," he decides he's going to send him a message that he's going to remember. And he calls the police. Alan gets charged with theft, he pleads guilty, and he has to go before a judge who sees that he has no criminal record, so he kind of goes easy on him, and he says that you need to pay back all the money you spent to your grandmother, and you need to go to an addiction program to try to break this habit of yours, to stop spending all this money. After Alan leaves court, his father felt like he finally got the message. It seemed like it had finally gotten through to him that this was a really big problem, and he felt like he had made the right decision in calling the police. But in reality, Alan hadn't changed at all. As soon as he got back from court, he was stealing from people outside of the family, he was taking loans from loan sharks, all of this just to keep up with his phony appearance he portrayed on social media. On October 9th, 2014, Alan owed $3,000 to a particular loan shark and had no way of paying it back. So instead of asking his parents for money, which for him would have been too embarrassing, he decides the best course of action is to kill his entire family. And so he strolls into his home and he shoots his mom dead, he shoots his sister dead, and then he waits for his dad to come home and he shoots him dead. Because his big plan is, with his whole family gone, he's going to become the sole heir to the family's estate, and that will be enough money to not only pay off this $3,000 debt, but have a little left over so he can go on vacation to Paris again. So after he's committed this horrible crime, he leaves his family where they are, he goes and takes the surveillance footage from inside the house, it was on a DVD, takes the DVD out, takes the murder weapon, leaves the house, chucks the DVD and the weapon into a lake, and proceeds to drive to Dallas, where he checks into a very fancy hotel and meets up with friends and parties the whole weekend. His friends that were with him that weekend would later tell investigators that Alan seemed totally normal. There was no red flags, there was no indication that anything was wrong. He was just laughing it up and having a great time that whole weekend. The following Monday, when Alan's father doesn't show up for work, the police are notified. They go to the house and they find the Ruby family. When police went out and got Alan and brought him back to the station to chat with him and tell him what happened and see if he knew anything, his sad reaction to his whole family now being deceased was apparently so insincere that officers almost immediately assumed that he was probably the guy that did it. Ultimately, Alan would confess and the prosecutor wanted to push for the death penalty, but Alan's remaining living family members actually said, "Don't do the death penalty. We don't want to risk that not happening. We want to see justice served right now. Can we create a plea agreement where he gets life in jail, but there's absolutely no way for him to get paroled, no matter how good his behavior is, no matter how old he is, no matter what, he can't ever get out of jail." And so they did. They created that plea agreement. They gave it to Alan to sign. He signs it, and as they're walking out of the courtroom, his last remaining family members disown him and say, "May God have mercy on your soul," and they leave. This is the picture that Alan uploaded to his Instagram account just hours after killing his entire family. They're all lying on the ground in his house at the time this picture is being taken. He's in this fancy hotel room with his friends, and the caption reads, "College wouldn't be half as fun without these two peaches. Hashtag best friends." One night in the early 1950s, a little boy named Issei Sagawa was having this dream where he and his brother were being boiled alive to be eaten. Sagawa says when he woke up, he immediately began fantasizing about what it would be like to be on the other side of that, to be on the outside with a human inside of the pot that you're boiling, that you're going to eat. And he became totally obsessed with the idea of eating another person. By the time he was in first grade, he would find himself staring at his different classmates' legs, and his mouth would be watering because he wanted to take a bite out of their leg. For 3 decades, he was able to suppress that urge, but in 1981, those cannibalistic urges would get the better of him. One summer day while he was in Tokyo, he saw this woman that he wanted to eat, and he couldn't help himself, and so he began following her down the road, and he saw her go into her apartment. He waited for a minute, went around back, and climbed in the window. And when he got inside, she was asleep. And he hadn't thought of a plan for what he was going to do once he was inside. And so he's just standing there thinking, well, now what do I do? How am I going to eat her? What am I going to do next? And as he's sitting there wondering what to do next, she wakes up and she screams, and he runs away. After this breaking and entering incident, Sagawa would actually seek help. So he goes to a psychiatrist and he says, this is what I did. I snuck into her house because I wanted to eat her. And the psychiatrist would end up telling Sagawa's family that I have to label him a high risk to society because he's not just thinking about doing these things, he's already acting out these fantasies. Now, Sagawa's father was extremely wealthy and powerful, and when he heard this from the psychiatrist, he was like, no, we're not going to do that. And so using his power and influence, he was able to kind of cover up what the psychiatrist had found, and he shipped his son to Paris. Once Sagawa landed in Paris, he enrolled at the Sorbonne University and began studying literature. Despite having sought help for his cannibalistic urges, when he was in Paris, he started having that urge again and he couldn't control it, and instead of going to another therapist or psychiatrist, he begins to look for another victim. Sagawa considered himself short, weak, and ugly, and so he was actually looking for a tall, beautiful Western woman so he could absorb their energy and somehow become a bigger, better version of himself. And so he began looking around Paris for tall, beautiful women that he could potentially eat, but no one seemed like a good fit until he met Renee Hartvelt. Renee was a tall, beautiful, 25-year-old Dutch student who was going to school with Sagawa at Sorbonne. In order to get close to her, Sagawa would ask his father if he would give him some money so he could hire Renee to be his personal tutor. His father gives him the money, Sagawa hires Renee, and they strike up this working relationship together. And over time, Sagawa would build trust with Renee, they would become friends, and at some point he asked Renee if she'll actually come over to his apartment, something they had not done yet. And she's sitting in his apartment with her back turned to him. He leaves the room and comes back with a rifle, and he tries to fire it, but it jams. And she hasn't heard him do this, and so he's standing there and his weapon's now jammed. He hasn't fired it, and he just puts the weapon away and comes back out and acts like nothing's happened. And he's sitting there wondering, is this a sign that I'm not supposed to do this? But at the end of the night, when she finally left, he decides, you know what, I gotta go through with this. I have to eat her. And so the next night he gets her to come over again. He gets the rifle out when she's sitting with her back to him once again, except this time the rifle fires. Only for an instant, he felt really bad and thought, maybe I should call an ambulance. But then he stopped himself and he said, you've waited so long for this. You gotta just go through with it. He immediately tried to take a bite out of her, but it was too difficult and unpalatable. So he calmly leaves his apartment, he goes to the store, he gets a blade, he comes back, and he's able to begin removing pieces of Renee so he can eat them. Over the next 2 days, Sagawa would eat most of Renee, and he would take pictures of himself throughout the entire experience. When he finally felt full, he left a couple pieces still in his freezer, but put the rest of her in a suitcase and went to dump her in a lake. But as he was wheeling these heavy suitcases around town, people saw them, and it just drew a lot of suspicion. And at some point, someone must have called the police. They show up, they ask him what's inside the suitcase, they open it up, and there's Renee. When questioned about it, he just said, I killed her to eat her flesh. Sagawa awaited trial for 2 years in a French prison, and when he finally went in front of a French judge, when the judge read the details of this crime, it seemed so crazy and outrageous that the judge decided there's no way Sagawa can be sane, and so he was deemed insane and unfit to stand trial. He was ordered to go to a mental institution where he would be held indefinitely. Shortly after that, the French deported Sagawa back to Japan, where they expected him to remain in a mental institution for the rest of his life. But that didn't happen because the French dropped his case and his documents were sealed. And when he arrived in Japan, the Japanese could not get access to his court documents, and so they did not have a case against Sagawa, and so they had to let him walk free. And so in 1986, Sagawa checked himself out of the Japanese mental institution that he had been sent to, and he's been free ever since. This is a picture of what police discovered when they opened up Sagawa's fridge inside of his apartment in Paris. This is a picture of his kitchen inside of that apartment, where you can clearly see plates and different utensils that were all used to eat Renee. This is a picture of the suitcase that Sagawa was lugging around that police showed up and asked him to open and found Renee inside of. And this is Sagawa today, walking freely in Tokyo, even though he blatantly killed and ate someone and openly admits to it and has even profited off of it. He's written books and he's been featured on TV shows. He's even been called in to be a food critic. But what's even more horrifying is that Sagawa openly says that before he dies, he's going to do this again. He can't live with himself unless he eats at least one more person. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Let me know in the comments what you thought, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you haven't done this already and you enjoyed today's video, please put a Kick Me sticky note on the back of the like button's shirt. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username on both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit. It's just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. If I use one of your suggestions on purpose, I will credit you. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, guys, that's going to do it. See ya.